Welcome to Dig, a history podcast. In the summer of 1943, the city of Los Angeles, California, erupted into what has become known as the Zoot Suit Riots, where roving bands of white servicemen beat and stripped Mexican-American youth of their distinctive zoot suits. The riots took place amidst the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial, a case characterized by the press as a crackdown on Mexican-American juvenile quote-unquote delinquency. In today's episode, part of our Crime and Punishment series, we're exploring the tinderbox that was Los Angeles during World War II. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Marissa.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig. As you hopefully already know, we have a co-authored book that hit the shelves last October. We have a lot of people to thank for helping us get to this point of publishing a beautiful magenta-jacketed book about spiritualism. And top of that list are all of our Patreon supporters. Our patrons funded research trips to Lilydale, the purchase of rare and weird books we needed, subscriptions to digital newspaper archives, and writing retreats to get this beauty done. We couldn't have done any of this without y'all, especially our auger and excavator level patrons. Lisa, Carl, Karen, Jesse, Maria, Denise, Edward, Lauren, Colin, Alyssa, and Susan. We can't thank you enough. Listener, if you enjoy what we do here but aren't yet a patron of the show, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
In the early 20th century, the city of Los Angeles transformed from a modest western city into a sprawling metropolis. Waves of migration changed the cultural landscape faster than roads could be built.
The area was already home to a significant population of Mexican heritage families, but during the Mexican Revolutionary period of 1910 to 1920, Mexican families crossed the border in large numbers, seeking refuge from the violence and chaos of their country's revolution. Their settlement patterns created vibrant neighborhoods where Spanish was spoken freely and traditional mercados flourished alongside Euro-American businesses.
The city's explosive growth began in earnest during the 1920s, as Euro-Americans from the Midwest sought opportunity and mild weather in Southern California. The 1930s saw another significant demographic shift as the Dust Bowl devastated the southern plains. Desperate farming families, their lands rendered worthless by drought and wind erosion, packed their remaining possessions and headed west. These displaced agricultural workers, immortalized in works like Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, arrived in Los Angeles with little more than hope.
Simultaneously, African Americans began arriving from the South as part of the broader Great Migration. They were drawn by the promise of industrial jobs and the possibility of escaping the Jim Crow laws that dominated Southern life. While Los Angeles wasn't free from discrimination, it offered opportunities that seemed impossible in the segregated South. These newcomers established communities like Central Avenue and Watts, which would soon become a vibrant center of African American culture and commerce.
The rapid influx of migrants created a complex social environment in Los Angeles. Neighborhoods developed distinct cultural identities, while tensions simmered as different groups competed for jobs, housing, and social status. The city's infrastructure and institutions struggled to adapt to this unprecedented growth, creating conditions that would eventually contribute to significant social unrest.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 radically transformed Los Angeles, turning a booming civilian metropolis into a critical wartime hub virtually overnight. As military recruitment drives swept through the city, thousands of white men traded their factory uniforms for military fatigues, leaving behind a vacuum in the booming defense industry. This void created opportunities for those previously excluded from these well-paying jobs. Women stepped into aircraft assembly lines, while African American and Latino workers found doors opening to positions that had been firmly closed just months before.
With its extensive coastline and crucial manufacturing facilities, Los Angeles felt particularly exposed to potential Japanese attacks. The once peaceful beaches became military zones, bristling with anti-aircraft batteries and observation posts. Civilian defense committees organized blackout drills and air raid practices. Residents learned to navigate nighttime streets illuminated only by blue defense lights, while air raid wardens patrolled residential areas ensuring compliance with blackout regulations.
This atmosphere of paranoia and racial tension found its most tragic expression in the forced expulsion of Japanese Americans living along the West Coast. Despite many Japanese heritage families having lived in Los Angeles for generations, their loyalty was suddenly questioned. Civil and military authorities, swept up in war hysteria, began viewing even the most mundane expressions of Japanese cultural identity, from language schools to traditional celebrations, as potential signs of espionage and disloyalty.
The response was swift and devastating. Executive Order 9066, issued by President Roosevelt, authorized and forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast to internment camps in the interior U.S., no matter if they were citizens of the United States or not. Japanese families were forced to sell businesses and homes at a fraction of their worth, often given just days to dispose of generations of accumulated property. They were then transported to hastily constructed internment camps in desolate inland areas, where they would spend years behind barbed wire, their constitutional rights suspended in the name of national security. This was not met with significant resistance from Los Angeles' non-Japanese population. Instead, many saw it as a necessary wartime measure.
Between San Diego and Los Angeles, military installations multiplied rapidly, transforming small coastal areas into bustling bases. Each weekend, the city's entertainment districts swelled with up to 50,000 servicemen on leave. These young men, many away from home for the first time, flooded into downtown dance halls, bars, and theaters, creating a volatile mix with the local populations. Many white soldiers were from rural areas and were unaccustomed to the racial mixing more common in an urban environment. Los Angeles streets became places where civilians crossed paths with uniformed soldiers and sailors seeking entertainment.
The wartime transformation of Los Angeles exposed and intensified deep-seated racial prejudices that had long simmered beneath the city's surface. In the midst of wartime anxieties and racial tensions, the jazz scene in Los Angeles was in full swing. Los Angeles was a jazz hub from the 1920s to the 1950s, with the city's African-American Central Avenue corridor as the center of the jazz scene, with many clubs and dance halls popular among the city's youth. As mainstream radio waves carried the sanitized sounds of the hit parade, jazz venues offered an environment full of music that was everything conventional society feared: sensual, spontaneous, and impossible to control.
On stage, black and white musicians played together, and the audience consisted of young people of different races moving to the same rhythms. In these smoky clubs and crowded dance halls, the strict social hierarchies of daytime Los Angeles had the potential to disappear. The zoot suit emerged as the visual embodiment of this cultural defiance.
Zoot suits were a style of menswear with an exaggerated silhouette. These suits were wide at the padded shoulders. The high-waisted pants ballooned in the middle and tapered dramatically at the ankles. Zoot suit wearers often accessorized with long chains that swung with each step, thick leather-soled shoes, and pork pie hats. The way these zoot suiters carried themselves became as distinctive as their clothing. They developed a characteristic stride, part strut, part glide, that radiated confidence and self-possession. Young women who adopted the style paired their suits with short and full skirts or pencil skirts and carefully styled hair, creating their own version of this defiant style. The zoot suit became a declaration of identity and a celebration of Black and brown youth culture.
The style itself had emerged from African-American urban communities, where it represented more than just mere fashion. It was a powerful statement of cultural pride and self-determination. As the look spread through Los Angeles's diverse neighborhoods, it found particularly enthusiastic adoption among Mexican-American, Italian-American, and Filipino youth. This cross-cultural embrace of African American style signified a significant shift in urban culture, as young people from different ethnic backgrounds found common ground in their appreciation for this bold fashion statement.
While the zoot suit transcended racial boundaries, it was Los Angeles Mexican American youth who found themselves most closely associated with, and ultimately targeted for, wearing these distinctive garments. Despite their status as American citizens, many born in the United States, young Mexican American men and women faced increasing scrutiny and harassment from local authorities who viewed their fashion choices as signs of delinquency.
The attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II brought sweeping changes to every aspect of civilian life. As the nation mobilized for total war, the government began implementing strict rationing policies that touched every sector of the economy. In March of 1942, the War Production Board turned its attention to clothing manufacture.
The new regulations mandated a dramatic reduction in fabric use, 26% across the board. Esquire magazine dubbed the resulting minimalist designs "streamlined suits by Uncle Sam." These new guidelines effectively outlawed the manufacture of zoot suits, whose silhouette and generous proportions required significantly more material than standard menswear. Women's fashion faced similar restrictions, with full skirts and dresses becoming more streamlined.
Most established tailoring businesses fell in line with the new requirements and stopped producing any garments that violated War Production Board guidelines. However, that did not stop the demand for zoot suits, and an underground economy centered in Los Angeles and New York City developed to supply the coveted suits. A network of bootleg tailors emerged, working to satisfy the continued desire for these now controversial garments. Young people who already owned zoot suits continued to wear them proudly, maintaining their distinctive style despite growing criticism.
This defiance of wartime rationing regulations struck a particularly raw nerve with servicemen and many white civilians. The zoot suit, which had begun as a fashion statement, was increasingly interpreted as an unpatriotic act. In these white Angelinos' eyes, every yard of excess fabric used in a zoot suit represented material diverted from the war effort, and the sight of young men strutting down the street in voluminous suits while soldiers wore standardized uniforms became a source of growing resentment and added a veneer of patriotic justification to existing racial prejudices.
Many Mexican-American youth self-identified as Pachucos or Pachucas, Mexican-American youth in the 1940s who rebelled against mainstream American culture through their style, music, and language. Historian Catherine Ramirez describes Pachuquismo as style, highlighting clothes like the zoot suit, but also hair, pompadours for men and women, and stark makeup for women. But she also highlights language and speech as ways that Pachucos set themselves apart from older Mexican society and from white American society. Not unlike the hep talk or jive that young African Americans adopted during the same period. If you've read the autobiography of Malcolm X, he describes that really well. In the early 1940s, authorities' obsession with Mexican American youth culture extended beyond this distinctive fashion and hairstyle to encompass their unique way of speaking. Law enforcement officials, newspaper reporters, and academics became increasingly fixated on Pachuco slang, treating this vibrant form of linguistic expression as yet another sign of supposed delinquency. So just as the zoot suit challenged mainstream fashion norms, Pachuco dialect, which was a creative blend of English, Spanish, and street slang, represented a form of cultural resistance that authorities found threatening.
On the outskirts of Los Angeles, in what would later become the city of Bell, was a reservoir known as the Sleepy Lagoon, where Mexican-American youth found refuge. In an era when racial segregation barred them from many of the city's public swimming pools and recreation facilities, this irrigation reservoir on the Williams Ranch became an unofficial gathering spot for young people seeking escape from the summer heat and the watchful eyes of authority. During daylight hours, teenagers splashed in its cooling waters, while after dark, the secluded spot transformed into a hangout spot for young couples.
On August 1st, 1942, several couples from the 38th Street neighborhood made their way to this familiar spot. Among them were Hank Levas and his girlfriend Dora Barrios. Levas was one of the older youths from the 38th Street neighborhood who was popular and whom many of the younger boys looked up to.
The night turned violent when a group of young men from a rival neighborhood launched an attack upon Levas and Barrios, who suffered a vicious beating. Hank Levas returned to his home turf on 38th Street to gather allies for a revenge attack. The attack on his girlfriend had crossed a line, and the youths, both young men and women, were ready to retaliate. Within hours, nearly 30 young people crowded into vehicles and set out for the Sleepy Lagoon.
Meanwhile, at another corner of the Williams Ranch, a very different gathering was taking place. Jose Diaz, a young man who was born in Mexico but had grown up in America, was celebrating at a friend's birthday party. The night held special significance for Diaz, as he was soon to report for his induction into the U.S. Army.
Finding no trace of his assailants at Sleepy Lagoon, Levas and the 38th Street kids heard the party drifting from the other side of the Williams Ranch. In their heightened state of anger and anticipation, the 38th Street group was convinced that Levas and Barrios' attackers had joined the party they could hear.
The peaceful fiesta erupted into chaos as the two groups collided. A bout of grandstanding and fighting took place before the combatants dispersed into the night. The scene appeared to be like any other aftermath of a teenage rumble. But as neighbors ventured out to investigate the disturbance, they made a grim discovery. In the shadows lay Jose Diaz, beaten and stabbed. He was taken to Los Angeles General Hospital and died later that night.
News of Diaz's death became a catalyst for broader political action, as Governor Cuthbert L. Olson seized upon the incident to address what he perceived as a growing crisis of juvenile delinquency. His response unleashed a massive dragnet operation by the Los Angeles Police Department that swept through Mexican-American neighborhoods, arresting more than 600 Mexican-American teens. Law enforcement particularly targeted those who wore the zoot suit or pachuco style. From this sweeping wave of arrests, Hank Levas and 22 others were ultimately charged with Diaz's murder.
In 1991, Lorena Encinas gave her version of the story to her son, Ted Encinas. According to her account, she had been among the guests at the Williams Ranch birthday party on the night of August 1st, 1942. She said the celebration was disrupted when her brother Luis and his friends attempted to crash the gathering. After a brief confrontation, the family demanded that the boys leave. Later, Luis reportedly confided in Lorena that he and his friends had attacked a young man who had just left the party. When police arrived to investigate reports of a murder near the property, Lorena refused to provide any information about the fight, not wanting to incriminate her brother. She, along with other young women from the 38th Street neighborhood, Frances Silva, Josefine and Juanita Gonzalez, and Dora Barrios, were taken into custody in the police's initial sweep.
The timing of these arrests wasn't coincidental. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1942, local newspapers had been stoking fears with sensationalized coverage of, quote, Mexican juvenile delinquency, end quote. This media campaign had successfully pressured city officials to acknowledge what they characterized as an awful situation requiring immediate attention. The Sleepy Lagoon case provided the perfect opportunity for authorities to demonstrate their tough stance on this perceived threat.
The resulting trial was named People v. Zamora, but became popularly known as the Sleepy Lagoon trial. Initially, many of Los Angeles's major newspapers gave the case only cursory attention. However, the Evening Herald and Express took a different approach, seizing upon the evocative Sleepy Lagoon name to craft a narrative that portrayed the accused as dangerous criminals. Their favorite phrase, goons of Sleepy Lagoon, transformed routine coverage of grand jury proceedings into sensationalized entertainment. Other newspapers followed suit. This heightened media attention placed enormous pressure on Judge Charles Williams Frick, who found himself presiding over what had become one of the most scrutinized trials in the city's history.
Lorena Encinas and the other women in custody were called to testify in the trial. Encinas refused to speak at the trial and was thrown into the Ventura School for Girls for her silence without the benefit of a jury or trial. She remained in prison there for 11 months until she was released when she turned 21 years old.
Judge Frick was the presiding judge and, like most of his fellow jurists in California, belonged to the city's white elite, a group increasingly troubled by the growing visibility and assertiveness of the Mexican-American community. Their concerns echoed through the pages of local newspapers, which painted lurid portraits of Mexican-American youth as dangerous outsiders.
Judge Frick's handling of the courtroom arrangements revealed how these prejudices could be embodied in legal procedure. Citing the logistical challenges of managing so many defendants, he ordered them seated in 2 alphabetical rows opposite the jury, physically separated from their attorneys who were confined to the defense table. This arrangement, which Frick defended as necessary for maintaining order, effectively severed the access between the accused and their legal representation.
Judge Frick ruled that attorney-client communications during proceedings constituted quote-unquote disruptions, and he only allowed the defense lawyers opportunities to consult with their clients during breaks. Furthermore, the prosecution deliberately weaponized the young men's appearance, insisting on referring to them as a gang while pointing to their zoot suit style and hairstyles as evidence of criminal character.
In a particularly cruel strategy, the prosecution orchestrated with court officers to deny the defendants basic grooming and clothing changes, denying them haircuts or clean clothes. As weeks passed, their unkempt hair grew longer and their clothing became increasingly soiled. When defense attorneys protested this deliberate degradation of their clients' appearance, Frick dismissed their objections. He declared that their disheveled state offered crucial insight into their character, conveniently ignoring that this appearance was engineered by the prosecution's own restrictions.
As the trial dragged on, Frick's growing impatience with the defense was evident. His particular target became George Shibley, a defense attorney who had joined the case after its start. Shibley's vigorous defense of his clients through frequent objections drew Frick's ire. Frick made a habit of openly belittling both Shibley and the accused in front of the jury, which undermined their credibility in the eyes of the jurors. Apparently, the presumption of innocence was a privilege reserved only for others, not these young Mexican-American defendants.
The verdict in the Sleepy Lagoon trial was decided in the newspapers well before the jury reached its decision in January 1943. When the sentences were finally handed down, their severity shocked even those who had expected harsh punishment. 5 of the 22 indicted were able to have separate trials funded by their families and were acquitted. Joe Carpio, Richard Gastelum, Edward Grandpre, Ruben Pina, and Daniel Verdugo. 5 were found guilty of assault and sentenced to 6 months to 1 year in jail, road camp, or the county farm. Andrew Acosta, Eugene Carpio, Victor Segovia, Benny Alvarez, and Joe Valenzuela. 9 young men were found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 5 years to life in San Quentin. Ismael Perra, Manuel Reyes, Victor Thompson, Henry Inostroza, Gus Zamora, Manuel Delgado, John Matthews, Jack Melendez, and Angel Padilla. 3 were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in San Quentin, one of California's most notorious prisons: Henry Levas, Jose Chepe Ruiz, and Robert Telles.
The trial served as the backdrop to daily interactions playing out on the streets of wartime Los Angeles, as escalating tension between servicemen and civilians, particularly in the city's ethnic neighborhoods, often ended in physical altercations. Military personnel on leave flooded into the city by the thousands, viewing it as their personal playground for drinking, womanizing, and brawling. While many residents accepted this intrusion as part of the war effort, others, especially in minority enclaves, refused to submit to the entitled behavior of many white servicemen.
A dangerous cycle of provocation and retaliation emerged in the city's ethnic neighborhoods. Young Black and Mexican American civilians, tired of some white military men's disrespect, began targeting drunk sailors heading back to their bases, robbing them in what became known as rolling attacks. The sailors, in turn, hurled racial insults as they passed through Black and Mexican neighborhoods. Whispers spread of white sailors prowling for Mexican-American girls, while military bases buzzed with tales of violent retribution against white servicemen who dared to date across racial lines. The situation was further inflamed by sailors' complaints about Mexican-American youth directing sexual taunts at their wives and girlfriends.
The traditional tensions between civilians and military personnel, common in any garrison town, became magnified through the lens of racial prejudice and cultural conflict. In Los Angeles's segregated neighborhoods, what might have been a simple friction between locals and visitors transformed into a powder keg of ethnic resentment and mutual distrust.
In May 1943, violence erupted at Venice Beach's popular Aragon Ballroom. The incident began with complaints from white high school students who resented the growing presence of Zoot Suiters along the beachfront. The situation escalated when soldiers arrived at the ballroom, spreading word that a sailor had been stabbed. A massive crowd, estimated at 500 people and consisting of both sailors and civilian whites, gathered outside the ballroom. As Mexican-American dancers began leaving the venue, they found themselves walking into an ambush. The mob descended upon them, targeting any young person who appeared to be Mexican-American, regardless of how they were dressed or their connection to any alleged incident.
The violence raged until 2 a.m. When the police finally intervened, they took the Mexican-American youth into custody, claiming it was, quote, for their own protection. And this rationalization of selective arrest would become a familiar pattern in the months to come, as law enforcement consistently arrested Mexican Americans while letting white servicemen and civilians go. The Venice riot served as a prelude to larger confrontations brewing in Los Angeles.
The evening of Memorial Day in 1943 set the stage for confrontation. As nightfall settled over downtown, about a dozen white servicemen, a mix of sailors and soldiers, spotted a group of young Mexican-American women across the street. They decided to change course and approach the women.
However, standing between the military men and the women was a group of young men wearing zoot suits. The encounter might have remained just another moment of street tension, but Sailor Joe Dacey Coleman grabbed one of the zoot-suited men by the arm, setting off a violent chain of events.
Before Coleman could react, a blow from behind knocked him unconscious. The scene exploded into chaos as other Mexican youths joined the fray, attacking the servicemen with rocks, bottles, and fists. The sailors managed to retreat, carrying the unconscious Coleman back to the Naval Armory.
As Coleman recovered from his injuries, his fellow sailors began organizing for revenge. 2 days later, on the night of Thursday, June 3rd, the beginning of what would become known as the Zoot Suit Riots commenced. And it's important to note here that riots really is a misleading term for what was essentially a series of organized attacks against ethnic minorities.
It's kind of like what they did with the Tulsa race riots.
It is. I mean, all of the quote-unquote race riots of the 20th century, I mean, many of them have already been renamed, and this one just hasn't. I mean, number one, because luckily nobody actually died in the riots, so it's kind of hard to call it a massacre. But so I don't know. It's still up for debate, right? Like what this should really be called.
Approximately 50 white sailors marched out of the Naval Armory that evening, armed with improvised weapons. Their first target was Alpine Street, a neighborhood that had seen numerous clashes between white servicemen and young Mexican-American civilians. Finding no zoot suiters there, the mob of sailors moved toward downtown, their frustration and anger building with each empty street. When they reached the Carmen Theater, they found their first victims, though not the hardened gangsters they claimed to be hunting.
The sailors forced the theater to turn on its house lights and then methodically searched the aisle for their targets. The victims they found were 12 and 13-year-old boys who had simply gone to see a movie. As other moviegoers watched and protested helplessly, the mob of sailors stripped and beat the boys in front of the entire theater and then threw their zoot suits into a makeshift fire.
That same night, 11 sailors disembarked from a bus on Main Street in downtown. Their encounter with a group of young Mexican Americans in zoot suits quickly devolved into conflict. The white sailors claimed they were victims of an unprovoked gang attack, while the Mexican-American youth maintained that servicemen had initiated the violence. The Los Angeles Police Department's Vengeance Squad arrived at the scene with the explicit intention of ridding Main Street from what they characterized as the, quote, loathsome influence of Pachuco gangs, end quote.
June 4th, the second night of violence, marked a dramatic escalation, both in scale and intent. As darkness fell, young Mexican Americans made bold displays of defiance, cruising past the Naval Armory and shouting challenges at the guards. This act of resistance, however, would soon be met with an overwhelming response that would transform isolated street fights into an assault on an entire community.
The sailors' retaliation was carefully orchestrated. About 200 servicemen commandeered a fleet of roughly 20 taxicabs. Rather than limiting their attacks to downtown areas or entertainment districts, they pushed into the heart of Mexican-American Los Angeles, the neighborhoods of East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights. No longer were these simply retaliatory strikes against perceived antagonists. They had evolved into a broad attack on the Mexican-American community itself. The sailors' taxi convoy swept through the barrio, storming into any establishment that might harbor their targets. Bars, cafes, and theaters all fell victim to their raids.
The attacks took on a ritual quality as the sailors stripped their victims of their zoot suits, targeting anyone wearing the distinctive style, regardless of their connection to any previous conflict. The Los Angeles Police Department's response to the escalating violence revealed a disturbing alignment with the attackers. Rather than fulfilling their duty to protect all citizens, officers openly admitted to a, quote, hands-off policy during the riots. One officer's post-riot justification was particularly telling. He claimed that because many police officers were veterans of World War I, they wouldn't, quote, pick on kids in the service, end quote. And this, of course, ignores the fact that Mexican Americans were overwhelmingly overrepresented in the armed forces, commensurate with their numbers in the larger population.
As media coverage of the attacks spread, it attracted more people to join the violence, and the riots took on a momentum of their own, expanding beyond their original targeting of zoot suiters to encompass anyone who appeared to be Mexican heritage. On June 5th, a group of adult Mexican-American musicians, none wearing zoot suits, were attacked as they left the Aztec Recording Company after a recording session.
The scale of the violence was captured in military commander Clarence Flogg's stark report describing, quote, hundreds of servicemen prowling downtown Los Angeles, end quote, in search of Mexican Americans to attack. The Navy's own documentation painted a disturbing picture of roving gangs of servicemen, armed with makeshift weapons, including clubs, belts, knives, and tire irons. These groups, ranging from 10 to 150 men, operated with tactical awareness, scattering whenever shore patrol approached.
California journalist and civil rights advocate Carey McWilliams was a witness to the violence, and he wrote, quote, marching through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, a mob of several thousand soldiers, sailors, and civilians proceeded to beat up every zoot suiter they could find. Pushing its way into the important motion picture theaters, the mob ordered the management to turn on the house lights and then ran up and down the aisles dragging Mexicans out of their seats. Streetcars were halted while Mexicans and some Filipinos and Negroes were jerked from their seats, pushed into the streets, and beaten with a sadistic frenzy, end quote.
In the midst of escalating violence, members of Los Angeles' Mexican-American professional class mobilized to seek official intervention. On June 5th, attorney Manuel Ruiz led a delegation of Mexican-American community leaders in meetings with city officials, attempting to use their position and influence to protect their community. Carey McWilliams reached out directly to California Attorney General Robert Kenney, pressing for Governor Earl Warren to launch an official investigation into the violence.
The urgency of their appeals was underscored by events of June 6th, as the riots pushed deeper into East Los Angeles, bringing terror to the heart of the Mexican-American community, forcing state officials to finally acknowledge the gravity of the situation.
Attorney General Kenney's meeting with McWilliams proved productive, resulting in the creation of the McGuckin Committee. Auxiliary Bishop Joseph T. McGuckin of Los Angeles was chosen to chair the investigation, reflecting an attempt to lend some moral authority to the proceedings. The committee's formation marked the first official recognition that the violence required formal investigation and response.
The violence reached its height on Monday, June 7th, as the riots transformed from targeted attacks into a massive display of racial violence. The local press became complicit in the attacks, with one Los Angeles newspaper brazenly publishing instructions for, quote, de-zooting victims, a step-by-step guide to public humiliation that called for stripping and destroying their clothing.
That night, downtown Los Angeles became the gathering point for an enormous mob of 5,000 people. The violence had now attracted participants far beyond the original group of white sailors from the armory. Military personnel, soldiers, Marines, and sailors traveled from bases as distant as Las Vegas and San Diego to join in the attacks. Local taxi drivers became willing accomplices, offering free rides to both servicemen and civilians heading to riot areas.
The white mob's division into two groups revealed the broadening scope of racial violence. One section headed south toward Watts, the city's predominantly African-American district, while another pushed east into Mexican-American neighborhoods. This split exposed how the riots had evolved from targeted attacks on zoot suiters into an opportunity for wholesale racial violence against minority communities.
The riots finally began to subside on June 8th. Senior military officials, recognizing the severity of the situation, took the dramatic step of declaring all of Los Angeles off limits to military personnel. The Shore Patrol, previously passive in the face of servicemen's violence, finally received orders to arrest servicemen involved in the disorders.
In a revealing response to the violence, the Los Angeles City Council chose to punish the victims rather than the perpetrators. They passed a resolution criminalizing the wearing of zoot suits, making the distinctive style punishable by 30 days in jail.
Sporadic confrontations continued through June 9th, but the intensity had diminished significantly. However, the aftermath revealed deep divisions in how city leaders interpreted the events. The McGuckin Committee, after careful investigation, identified racism as the fundamental cause of the riots, a conclusion that pointed to deep-seated social problems requiring serious attention and reform.
Mayor Fletcher Beauron, however, offered a starkly different interpretation that revealed the depth of official denial. He laid blame on juvenile delinquents and white Southerners, explicitly rejecting any role of racial prejudice in the violence.
A week after the riots subsided, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt addressed the violent events in Los Angeles through her weekly newspaper column, breaking from the superficial explanations offered by local officials. She stated that the riots represented deep-seated racial prejudice, particularly against Mexican Americans in the United States.
The Los Angeles Times' reaction to Roosevelt's commentary is telling. The paper attacked the First Lady, accusing her of having communist sympathies and inflaming racial tensions, a common tactic used to discredit those who spoke out against racial injustice. Does this sound familiar to anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion diatribes, doesn't it? All the anti-DEI stuff. Arguing that DEI is itself racism, right?
Yeah, exactly. The investigation by the State Un-American Activities Committee under Senator Jack Tenney took an even more bizarre tactic. Or maybe it's not bizarre, maybe it's very pointed, right? Tenney's committee arrived in Los Angeles on June 21st, ostensibly to investigate whether the riots were orchestrated by Nazi agents attempting to drive a wedge between the United States and Latin American countries. Despite Tenney's claims of possessing evidence of Axis-sponsored involvement, no such proof ever materialized.
Japanese propaganda broadcasts seized upon the violence, using the racist violence of white servicemen against Mexican Americans to challenge America's moral authority and expose the contradictions between its fight against fascism abroad and its treatment of minorities at home.
A few months later, on appeal, the Sleepy Lagoon case entered a new phase in November as defense attorney Ben Margolis Jr. mounted a massive legal challenge. His 508-page appeal brief to the Second District Court of Appeals documented the numerous procedural irregularities and constitutional violations that had characterized the original Sleepy Lagoon trial. The sheer volume of the brief reflected both the complexity of the case and the magnitude of judicial misconduct that had marred the proceedings.
Supporters of the defendants recognized the need for a more focused and permanent organizational structure to sustain their advocacy efforts. On November 4th, the Citizens Committee for the Defense of Mexican American Youth, organized by labor activist LaRue McCormick, underwent a strategic transformation, emerging as the newly christened Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee. This reorganization brought two powerful advocates into leadership positions. Carrie McWilliams, the previously mentioned journalist and civil rights advocate, assumed the role of national chair, and Alice Greenfield McGrath stepped in as executive secretary. McGrath forged close relationships with many of the youths jailed at San Quentin, visiting them often and keeping them and the public abreast of the appeal process.
The appeal process for the Sleepy Lagoon case reached its crucial moment on May 15, 1944, when Margolis presented his oral arguments before the Second District Court of Appeals. Meanwhile, the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee launched an innovative fundraising campaign, publishing Guy Endor's The Sleepy Lagoon Mystery, and the book sold over 25,000 copies in just 3 months.
Manny Delgado was the first defendant released on parole and immediately joined the staff of the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee, working to help free his fellow defendants. On October 2nd, the Second District Court of Appeals overturned all of the Sleepy Lagoon verdicts. Judge Clement Nye subsequently dismissed the case entirely, leading to the release of Hank Levas and his co-defendants with their record cleared. The appeals court decision hinged on Judge Frick's egregious conduct during the original trial, particularly his ruling that prevented defendants from consulting with their attorneys during proceedings, a clear violation of their constitutional rights. While the defendants regained their freedom and cleared their names, the case was never reopened for a proper investigation. The shadow of uncertainty remained. The defendant's innocence was never fully established in court, and the true killer of Jose Diaz was never identified or brought to justice.
Judge Frick's handling of the Sleepy Lagoon trial, despite its eventual overturning and clear evidence of judicial misconduct, did nothing to diminish his professional standing or career trajectory. He continued to win re-election to the bench for more than 2 decades after the trial, serving until shortly before his death in 1958. Furthermore, his textbooks on criminal law, which he continued to author and update throughout his career, became standard texts in California's law schools. These works remained in use even after his death, shaping new generations of legal professionals long after the Sleepy Lagoon case.
8 decades after the events of 1943, the city of Los Angeles officially acknowledged its role in the Zoot Suit Riots. On June 9, 2023, the Los Angeles City Council finally issued a public condemnation of the riots and apologized for the city's contribution to the violence. So that's all we've got for you guys today. Visit our website at digpodcast.org. You'll find transcripts and show notes. You'll also find lesson plans. You can follow us at dig_history at Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the places. And we love to get listener mail. It's hello@digpodcast.org. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening.
Encinas refused to speak at the trial and was thrown... Sorry, your banner keeps...
I'm sorry.
Keep jumping around my area. His response unleashed a massive magnet operation.
She, along with other young styles, as evidence of criminal.
And Angel Padilla. Yeah. Okay. And Angel, I did the first name right.
Flourished alongside Euro-American businesses. Dog just barked.
From a modern Western city into a sprawling...
Modest.
I was going to say, that's not that much of a transformation, Elizabeth, but no, I get it. My bad.